Okay, this is a rough draft recording about a dysfunctional family. Well, one particular person in the dysfunctional family. This is Vivian. And Vivian, going to start from the beginning. Vivian, she didn't realize it until probably around the first grade that she then started to see differences between herself and other kids. She was young, around first grade, and then she started seeing, the differences in the way her siblings were acting toward her or all around than other kids. Now, this was back in the day when they didn't even have, like cell phones and such. And in her home, they didn't have, they had one TV, and it was in the living room, and basically their dad, she had 4 siblings, so there were 5 of them all together. But their dad, he watched whatever he wanted to watch after he had been work all day, and wouldn't let them watch what they wanted to watch. And it was just the rule. He watched what he wanted to watch. Now, back then, there was no cable TV, and it was just like 3 channels, and they even had a black and white TV. And their mother, she basically stayed in her room and watched. She didn't watch TV. She listened to the radio. Okay, she had one of those handheld radios, and so they didn't have much to see outside. There wasn't any. They really saw the kids in the neighborhood, but not that much. They didn't, until school. Then she started to realize there's a difference here. Some of the way between her and other kids, and her family and theirs, from what she heard from them. And but I'll list a few other things. Okay, now one of the things is that Vivian, she didn't realize these kinds of things until she got older. They're all she and her siblings are all in their 50s, and their parents have passed away, and their grandparents too. They're basically pretty much all that they have left, because they're kind of distanced from cousins and anybody else, anybody else that's in as far as family. So now, what they didn't, they didn't see a lot of these things, and didn't realize them. She realized them as she got older. Things like that her family, she was pretty much neglected. They didn't teach her the basic things, and didn't teach any of them. I'm just going to say her, but because she was the one that realized they just didn't teach things. It was neglect and other forms, from her mother, and other forms of abuse from her father. A lot of emotional, verbal, socioeconomic abuse in the family. And they were such things. They were, they really didn't, have enough clothing to wear. They just didn't have enough, clothing, enough supplies like hairbrushes. They didn't really have much in touch with the outside world, like I was explaining, because there was the one TV, and then their mother had the radio, pretty much it. And that was back in the day, no cell phones and no games, to play on the computer, no computers, no home computers, they just didn't have much. And they were taught in some way, not to ask for things. And if they asked for something like, they were told they had to wear, this to go to church, or, go somewhere with them. When it's usually the only place they ever went with them was to church or to their cousin's house. And they said that you had to dress appropriately. But they didn't have enough clothing. And when, the girls got to the age of wearing hose, asking for hose was a big issue. Is why did you tear up your old ones? And what did you do? Why did, it was always some form of, it's your fault and we shouldn't have to pay money for that. And it was a big, it was a big deal. So they basically learned from that not to ask for things like to go to a doctor, not to ask, they weren't taught, much about personal hygiene, not to ask for supplies like toothbrushes and toothpaste, shampoo. They weren't taught these things, soap, none of it. And so there was a lot of neglect going on. And like I said, they were taught not to ask for things. Okay? And let's see. So they didn't have much of anything. And like I just said, if you asked, you were in some form, shape, form, or fashion abused. Okay, in her family. Okay, I'm taking notes here. Let's see. And then as time went by, she started to realize that, okay, to move on to the next one. Let's see. Also, things like they were never comforted. Like if, well, I can't say it is that way for all of them. Okay. Now, for Vivian, like whenever, she was never, like if she got hurt, if she was on her bicycle and, scraped her knee or something, she fell, scraped her knee, whatever, or just walking and scraped your knee. And when you're a kid, it can happen. And at any age, it can happen. She was never comforted by her parents. Her mother was very distant and basically stayed in her room all the time. And her dad wasn't going to do it. And at times, he found it funny. He thought a fall was funny. When any of them hurt themselves, it was funny. And something to laugh at. But never the comfort of, come here, let them cry, cry it out, and, what you would think of as comforting to a child when they got a bobo, No, that was just not part of it. In fact, it was more like, why did you do that? What were you doing that you weren't paying attention to what you were doing? And that shouldn't have happened. And then laughter. Well, usually first laughter, then the whole thing of why. Why did you do it? Okay. And at some point in her life, she, started to see that her parents, they had their favorites. Now, some people think that a favorite of either parent or both is going to be the golden child. That's not necessarily true. Okay, it can be one that the parents, each parent has their own favorite and they're trying to groom them for something. Like one might be trying to groom them to be like them when their behaviors are narcissistic. The other one might be trying to groom them when their behaviors are histrionic. Or just to groom them to be the child that is going to take care of them. They could have both, They could have more than one favorite, too. Okay, and one of them that can be the one like Vivian, the one abused the most, in that it can be one that one of them sees as a favorite, but it's not really the favorite. It's the favorite to pick on. When you're young, you see it in those views as Vivian, one to pick on, one to basically abuse, whatever form. Physical abuse is not the only type of abuse, but in Vivian's case, it involved that. Okay, to a point. Anyway, she started to see that her parents had favorites, and that they had roles to play within the family. That she played this role, and her siblings each had a role. And let's see. Now, I remember the roles went something along the line of like the forgotten child, the scapegoat, the comedian, the black sheep, different types like that. But there's so many different types if you read. But it depends on what kind of family type. In this family, there was no substance abuse of any kind, no chemical dependency, like, no alcohol or no drugs, okay, to put it simple. And, but they did each see that they had a role, and they played that role. Vivian was the only one to realize what her role was, and it was basically, I cannot remember the name of it, the mascot, maybe? And she didn't want to play any role. Okay. Anyway, to move on a little bit more from my notes, And that of, some in families, they learn to survive, when they're young by lying, through different, sometimes it's lying through omission and just not telling the parents what happened. Some might see it as, like having one another sign their report cards, and parents are so, they just aren't paying attention enough to even ask about that. And but some, learn how to lie, some learn how to cheat, some learn to become what their parents set up, like narcissistic or histrionic, borderline, or even antisocial. The 4 cluster Bs. Anyway, but some become empath. What some people call empaths. Now, to me, it's just good, decent person. Okay. But some see it, as empath is a special kind of thing that they can feel empathy for others and so on. There's some more to it. But some of them, I'm just going to say, some of them become good, decent people. Okay. But they may have, and there's a good possibility, some of them will have, other issues as they grow up from being in an abusive family. So, anyway, and also in these kinds of families, in different kinds of families, but say in, dysfunctional families, abusive families, as she learned, as she grew up, that they have no boundaries. They will say, they can do, they can, whatever they feel like it, the parents, and possibly even the grandparents. Sometimes the grandparents don't even know. Okay, and, but they have no boundaries, the parents. They just, maybe one of them, whatever they see around anybody, they just don't respect, they don't see that there should be boundaries at all. Then there are some things with kids that, yes, kids need to learn about having their own personal boundaries, and they need to have their own personal boundaries, and they need to learn how to respect other people's personal boundaries too. But when they have a parent that doesn't have any, doesn't see that there should be any kind of teaching at all, neglect, and doesn't see any boundaries, what are they going to learn? They may learn from other kids. They may be able to learn from school, and as school goes, changes a lot. But anyway, this is about Vivian, as I said. Now, there's a whole story about this one particular family, and I am doing this, and it's basically something that Poppy's going to, a woman named Poppy, she's a sociologist, a social scientist, and she is in Victorson County, Texas. It's all hypothetical, fictional stories, but Poppy is the professional who's going to be making stories out of these. Some of it was sent to her as vignettes. Some was like I just went through, and depending on how the counselors and the other mental health care professionals in the county sent them to her, and there are other people like Dawn and David, and Dawn and David are brother and sister, and Poppy has a sister named Polly who does it, and starting early in 2020, they start writing stories for the radio, and it kind of went, for the county. The county had its own radio station, and it kind of, became very popular, and people wanted more stories about these kinds of things, that are fictional, hypothetical, fictional, like I said, hypothetical kind of situations that are fiction. And so this is one. Poppy, like I said, Poppy, she's in her 50s, and she had, for her main one, were V letters. Okay, the letter V. It was it's a family. It's a fictional family of 5 siblings. Like I said, just said. But I'm going to be going through, what Poppy would be talking about, and then they have ghostwriters that make it for radio. And then the actual healthcare professionals, not the actual, but the healthcare professionals in the county would talk about, and once they do the stories, they talk about what is right and what is wrong, okay, and what is typical or something like that. But basically, they started off, and it goes from there. It's a whole cycle. It's a whole thing. But anyway, this is the first one about Vivian, her dysfunctional family. And that's the one that starts off with her growing up as a child. All right, enough of this on this one. I'll talk to you on another video. And by the way, they're all copyrighted to me. All right.